The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting long, haunting shadows across the battlefield. The air was thick with the smell of burning debris and the metallic scent of blood, a stark reminder of the brutal war that had raged on for days. Among the wreckage and the bodies of fallen warriors, a young alien woman knelt beside the lifeless form of her sister, her heart heavy with grief. She wept, the tears streaking down her face, mixing with the dirt and the blood that clung to her skin. Her name was Kelra, and she had just lost the one person in the universe who had mattered most to her. Her sister, Vala, had been more than family. She had been her strength, her protector. Together, they had fought through countless battles side by side with their bond unbreakable. But now, Vala lay motionless, her once bright eyes closed forever. Kelra's sobs filled the night, drowning out the sounds of distant gunfire and the faint crackling of burning structures. Vala Kelra whispered through her tears, her voice trembling. Why did you have to leave me alone?" The weight of the world seemed to press down on her as she sat there, cradling her sister's lifeless body in her arms. In her heart, Kelra knew that the war had claimed many lives, but the loss of Vala felt like a piece of her soul had been ripped away. There was nothing left in the world for her now, no reason to keep fighting. The endless conflict, the bloodshed, all seemed meaningless without her sister by her side. Kelra's fingers traced the soft contours of Vala's face, a gesture that felt both comforting and heartbreaking. She couldn't understand why it had to be this way. They had fought together. They had survived together. But in the end, only one of them would live to tell the tale, as she continued to mourn. The sky above darkened, the stars obscured by the thick smoke rising from the ruins. The battlefield had gone quiet, but Kelra didn't notice. She didn't hear the sound of footsteps approaching from behind her, or the faint crackle of communication devices on the battlefield. She didn't notice the human soldier who had silently crept into the area, crouching low among the wreckage, his weapon at the ready. He had been part of the rescue team sent to extract survivors, but by the time he had arrived, the fighting was already over. The battle was lost, and the aliens were retreating. But it was the sight of the young alien woman mourning her sister that had stopped him in his tracks. It was her grief, raw and powerful, that had made him pause. The soldier, a man named Marcus, didn't understand the alien culture. He didn't know what Kelra's species was capable of. He didn't know what she had lost, but he understood loss. He understood the weight of grief, the hollow ache that consumed you when you lost someone you loved. And as he watched her kneel beside her sister, he knew that he couldn't leave her there, alone in the darkness. For a long time, Marcus watched from the shadows, weighing his options. He had been trained to follow orders, to stay focused on the mission. But something about Kelra's pain reached him in a way he hadn't expected. His mission was clear: find any survivors, extract them from the war zone, and get them to safety. But the human part of him, the part that had lost friends in wars just like this one, was telling him that this was different. Kelra was different. After what felt like an eternity, he finally made his decision. He would approach her. He would offer her the help she didn't ask for. He would get her out of this place, away from the battlefield. He would save her life even if she didn't realize it yet. With slow, careful steps, Marcus moved toward her, his hand instinctively gripping the weapon at his side, ready to defend himself if necessary. But his heart wasn't in it. He wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to wage war. He was here to do what no one else had done, offer mercy. Kelra, lost in her grief, didn't notice him until he was standing right behind her, his shadow falling across her and her sister. When she turned, her hand instinctively went to the weapon at her side. But she froze when she saw who it was: a human. Her eyes narrowed, instinctively preparing for a fight. The humans had been the enemy, and This war, the ones who had ravaged her home and killed her people. But this human, standing before her, didn't look like a soldier ready to kill. His eyes were full of something she had never seen before: sympathy, compassion, even sorrow. He wasn't here to fight. He was here for something else. "I'm not here to hurt you," Marcus said quietly, his voice gentle. "I'm here to help, to get you out of this place." Kelra's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him, uncertain. She couldn't understand why a human would want to help her. The humans had been the ones who had torn her world apart. They had killed her people, taken her family from her. Why would he want to save her now? She opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? She didn't even know if she could trust him. She didn't know if she could trust anyone anymore. Kelra began, but her voice cracked, and all that came out was a choked sob. Marcus stepped forward cautiously, his eyes softening. "I know this is hard. I don't know what you've been through, but I can help. Let me help." For a moment, Kelra just stared at him, her heart torn between the overwhelming grief of losing her sister and the uncertainty of accepting help from the very beings she had learned to hate. She looked down at Vela's body one last time, tears welling in her eyes. Then, with a shuddering breath, she stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She had lost so much, but something about this human's voice, something about the way he looked at her, made her feel like there was still a chance. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't stay here. "Not like this. Take me," she said, her voice trembling. "Take me away from this place." Marcus nodded, relief flooding through him. He stepped forward, offering his hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Kelra took it as they walked away from the battlefield. The night seemed quieter, the weight of the loss still heavy on her heart, but there was something else too. Hope, a tiny, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a new purpose in this shattered world. The battlefield was behind them now, a fading memory swallowed by the vast wilderness ahead. Kelra's eyes flicked over her shoulder once, just as Marcus led her through the dense undergrowth of the alien forest. The sounds of war screams, gunfire, explosions had long since faded, replaced by the peaceful chirping of distant creatures and the rustle of leaves underfoot. But no matter how far she walked, she couldn't shake the weight of the loss. Her sister's body was gone, taken by the chaos of war. All that remained was the heavy ache in her chest. The memories of her sister's laughter, her warmth, the bond they shared, everything was gone now. She had nothing left, and the man beside her, a human soldier, was the one who had saved her. It didn't make sense. How could someone like him be trusted? Marcus kept his pace steady, making sure to lead her carefully through the thick forest. His voice broke through the silence as they moved. "We need to keep going, Kelra. It's not safe out here for long." Kelra didn't respond right away. She couldn't bring herself to speak, her mind a jumbled mess of confusion. Trusting him didn't feel right. She had spent so long seeing humans as the enemy, the ones who destroyed her world, slaughtered her people, and tore apart everything she had loved. Now, here she was, walking beside one of her life in his hands. It was absurd. But then, she thought about the way he had approached her carefully, with no weapon drawn, offering her his hand in her moment of despair. There had been no malice in his eyes, just a quiet understanding, and that made her doubt everything she had known about humanity. They walked in silence for several more hours, the canopy above them growing thicker as they ventured deeper into the alien forest. Kelra had no idea where they were going, no sense of direction, only the human soldier guiding her through the wild terrain. It felt strange. She was a warrior, trained to navigate the harshest of environments, but here, with this man, she felt. Lost, Marcus led her to a small clearing near the edge of the forest. A low, jagged cliff rose up to one side, the ground underfoot soft and damp. He set down his pack, pulling out a small, portable shelter and a few supplies. Kelra, still unsure of everything, hesitated but sat down on a nearby rock. The silence between them grew heavier. Kelra glanced up at Marcus, who was unpacking the shelter and setting up camp. She wanted to ask questions about him, about why he had saved her, about everything, but the words stuck in her throat. The truth was, she was afraid. Afraid of what would happen next. Afraid of what her future would look like now that everything had changed. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice breaking through the quiet. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, almost as though reading her mind. "You may not trust me, and I understand that, but I can help you. I don't know where you were headed or what you were planning, but I'm offering you a chance to survive." Looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. She didn't want to trust him, but there was something about the way he spoke that made her hesitate. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. "Why? Help me?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the grief that still choked her. Marcus paused for a moment, his hands stilling as he looked down at the ground. "Because, for all the destruction I've seen, for all the war and death, I still believe there's a way to make things right, even if it's just helping one person at a time, and right now, that person is you." Kelra didn't know what to say. She was still trying to process everything. She had lost her sister. She had lost everything. What could a human possibly offer her now? "You're the last of your people," Marcus continued, his voice softer now. "I don't know what it's like for you, but I can't imagine the pain of losing everything. But that doesn't mean it's the end. You have a chance to rebuild, to survive, if you let me help you." Kelra felt something stirred deep inside hers. Something small, but growing, hope. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope had betrayed her before, left her to mourn the ones she loved. But now, as she looked at this man who had saved her life, something inside her shifted. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But I don't have anywhere else to go." Marcus met her gaze and nodded. "That's all I can ask for. Let me help you. Let's just take it one step at a time. We don't need to figure everything out today, but we'll figure it out together." The weight of his words settled around her like a warm blanket, unfamiliar and yet comforting. It was a promise, one that she wasn't ready to accept, but one that she couldn't ignore. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kelra allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something beyond the grief and the war. As the night settled in, Kelra found herself sitting beside Marcus, their campfire flickering in front of them. The stars above were distant, cold, and silent, much like Kelra's heart had felt in the aftermath of her sister's death. But as the fire crackled and warmth spread through her, she couldn't help but wonder if, for the first time in a long while, there might be a path forward, one where she wasn't alone. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still battles to fight, enemies to face, and questions to answer. Kelra didn't know where her journey would take her, but for the first time in days, she was willing to walk it. And somewhere, deep inside her, a small spark of hope began to flicker again. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on Kelra's face as she sat silently beside Marcus. The night was quiet, the sounds of distant creatures drifting through the air, but the silence between them felt heavy. Kelra couldn't bring herself to speak, and Marcus respected that. He understood more than she realized, having seen firsthand what war could do to a person. She didn't know why he hadn't just left her there on the battlefield after her sister died. He could have easily walked away, left her to her grief, just like so many others had. But Marcus had stayed, and now he was sitting there beside her, offering her a chance. A chance to survive, to move beyond the pain that had nearly consumed her. "Where are we going?" Kelra asked, her voice quiet but steady. She was tired, physically and emotionally drained. But the question had been lingering in her mind since the moment they'd left the wreckage. Marcus looked up from the fire, his expression thoughtful. "We're heading for a safe zone. It's a small outpost, just a few humans and aliens, working together to rebuild after the war. It's not much, but it's a start." Kelra listened to his words, but doubts still lingered in her mind. A safe zone. How could she ever be safe again? Her entire world had been destroyed. Her people wiped out, her sister gone. How could she possibly rebuild? "You can't rebuild what's been lost," she muttered, her voice thick with sorrow. "Everything ... everything is gone." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just watched her, his eyes soft, understanding. "Maybe you can't bring back what's gone, but you can find something new, something worth fighting for." Kelra looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and pain. "You think there's something worth fighting for after everything that's happened?" Marcus nodded, slowly. "I think there's always something worth fighting for, Kelra. Maybe it's not always what we expect, but sometimes ... It's just about taking the next step, even if it's small." She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to find hope in a world that had taken everything from her. But for the first time, she felt like maybe Marcus wasn't just giving her empty words. Maybe there was a kernel of truth in them. The next morning, they continued their journey through the dense forest. The sun filtered through the trees, casting shafts of light onto the path ahead. Marcus led the way, keeping his eyes sharp, always alert for danger. Kelra followed closely, her movements slow, her body still aching from the previous night's exhaustion. Every step felt heavy, as though the weight of her loss was pressing down on her with each passing moment. Yet, as they walked, she couldn't ignore the flickering spark of curiosity that had been growing inside her. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered humans in her life. They had been the enemy for as long as she could remember, a species bent on destruction. But Marcus ... he was different. He wasn't like the others. She couldn't explain why, but there was something about him that made her wonder if maybe not all humans were like the soldiers she had fought against. "You've been quiet," Marcus said, breaking the silence as they walked. "I get it, this isn't easy, but if you need to talk..." Kelra shook her head, unwilling to speak of the pain yet. Not now. The grief was still too raw. "It's just hard to think. I don't know what to do anymore." Marcus nodded, as if he understood. "Don't have to have all the answers. One step at a time, remember?" Kelra glanced at him, feeling the weight of his words sink in. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe, just maybe, taking things one step at a time was the only way forward. The thought gave her a strange sense of calm, though it was fleeting. She still wasn't sure she could trust him entirely. The memory of her sister, Valaher's lifeless body on the battlefield, was still fresh in her mind. But in the presence of this human soldier, she felt ... something else. Maybe not trust. Not yet. But perhaps, somewhere deep down, there was a spark of hope. By midday, they came across a small clearing in the forest. The path they had been following suddenly opened into a wide, flat area where the remnants of an old camp could be seen. There were broken tents, charred remnants of fires, and makeshift barricades scattered across the clearing. It looked abandoned, yet something about it felt different. It felt ... lived -in. Marcus stopped, scanning the area. "We're getting closer." Kelra frowned, looking around. The outpost didn't seem like much, but it was a sign. There were people here. There were survivors. Maybe this was the chance she... Been looking for the chance to rebuild, to find some purpose beyond the battlefield. As they moved closer to the camp, the sound of footsteps reached their ears. They weren't alone. From behind a pile of debris, a figure stepped forward. It was another human, this one older, grizzled, with a scar running down one side of his face. His eyes were hard, but when they landed on Marcus, they softened. "Marcus," the man said, his voice deep but welcoming. "Glad to see you made it. Who's your friend?" Marcus nodded toward Kelra, standing a little behind him. "This is Kelra. She's with me now." The man gave Kelra a long look, his gaze searching. "I'm Captain Reynolds," he said, his tone cautious but not unkind. "You're safe here. We're rebuilding, trying to make a home out of this mess." Kelra stood still, taking in the sight of the camp. The people here, despite the scars of war on them, were alive. They were survivors. They were fighting to rebuild something that had been broken, just like her. For the first time in a long while, Kelra felt the smallest flicker of hope. The camp was quiet, peaceful even, despite the war-torn memories that clung to the air. There were tents and makeshift shelters scattered around, but there was a sense of purpose in the way the survivors moved. They weren't just trying to exist anymore. They were trying to rebuild, to find something worth fighting for. The people here were all scarred, but they were alive, and that, Kelra realized, was more than she could have hoped for just a few days ago. Captain Reynolds led them toward the central fire pit where a group of survivors were gathered. Some working, others talking quietly, and a few simply staring into the distance, lost in their own thoughts. The soldiers here were different from the ones Kelra had known, the ones who had destroyed her world. These people weren't looking for a fight. They were trying to survive, to live. It was a stark contrast to everything Kelra had been taught to believe about humans. "Reynolds," a young woman called as she approached, her face friendly, but her eyes wary. "Who's this?" "This is Kelra," Reynolds replied, his voice steady. "She's one of the survivors from the latest battle. She's not one of us, but she's with us now." The woman eyed Kelra cautiously, but didn't say anything for a moment. She seemed to be studying her, as though trying to gauge whether or not she was a threat. Could feel the scrutiny on her, but she didn't flinch. She had been studied by enemies before. This was nothing new. "What's your name?" the woman asked, finally breaking the silence. "Kelra," she replied, her voice firm, but still tinged with the rawness of grief. She wasn't sure why she had answered so easily. It was strange, letting people know her name, letting them know who she was after everything that had happened. But something about the woman's calm presence made it easier. "Well, Kelra," the woman said, a small smile breaking through. "I'm Ilara. Welcome, I guess." Kelra nodded, but she didn't smile back. She didn't know how to smile anymore. Not after the things she had seen, the people she had lost. But Ilara didn't seem to expect anything from her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just accepting. "Come sit by the fire," Ilara continued, gesturing toward a low stone circle where a small fire flickered. "We have food, if you're hungry, and you'll need to rest." Kelra hesitated, but then nodded, following the woman over to the fire. She sat down slowly, glancing around at the other survivors. There were men and women of all ages, most of them looking just as exhausted as she felt. They were survivors, just like her. They had endured the same horrors, the same battles, the same losses, but they were still here. They were still fighting. And somehow, that made her feel a little less alone. Marcus joined them at the fire, sitting on the opposite side of Kelra. He gave her a small nod, but didn't say anything, sensing that she needed space. Kelra appreciated the quiet understanding. She wasn't ready to talk yet, not about her sister. Not about the pain that had been gnawing at her since the moment she had lost everything. "Food's coming," Elora said as she began to stir something in a pot over the fire. The smell of the stew wafted through the air, thick and earthy. Kelra's stomach growled, betraying the exhaustion she had tried to ignore. She hadn't eaten much since the battle. The pain of losing her sister had overshadowed everything. But now, with the warmth of the fire at her back and the promise of food in front of her, she realized just how badly she needed it. "So, how did you end up in this mess?" Elora asked casually, as she passed Kelra a small bowl of stew. "Don't mean to pry, but, well, this war's been hard on all of us. Everyone here has a story." Kelra looked down at the stew, the warmth of it rising up to meet her cold hands. She wasn't sure how to answer. Her story felt so tangled, so full of loss that she didn't even know where to begin. But something in the way Elora spoke, so casually, made Kelra feel like it was okay to share, even just a little. I lost everything," she started slowly, her voice distant. "My sister, my people, ... everything." Elora nodded, as though she understood all too well. "We've all lost something. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore, Kelra. We're here to help. We're rebuilding. You can help too, if you want." Kelra's heart clenched, the words pulling at the raw edges of her grief. She hadn't thought about rebuilding. She had thought about surviving. She had thought about moving from one moment of pain to the next. Rebuilding. Could she really do that? Could she really find something worth fighting for again? Before she could respond, Marcus spoke up. His voice was quiet, but steady. "Rebuilding is hard. It's not something that happens overnight, but you don't have to do it alone. We all have to start somewhere." Kelra looked at him, meeting his gaze for the first time since they had left the battlefield. There was a sincerity in his eyes that made her want to believe him. Maybe she could rebuild. Maybe she could find some small piece of herself in this new world. But part of her was still afraid. Afraid of trusting again. Afraid of losing more. She had lost so much already. Elora, noticing the hesitation, smiled softly. "One step at a time, Kelra. Just one step." For the first time in a long while, Kelra didn't feel the urge to pull away, to lock herself in her grief. She looked around at the people gathered around the fire, their faces worn but determined. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The road ahead would be long. There were still battles to fight, still losses to bear. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a new purpose here among these survivors. These people who had also lost so much, but who still had the strength to rebuild. The journey was only just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of small tasks, quiet conversations, and the steady rhythm of survival. Kelra began to settle into the camp, though it felt strange. The weight of her grief still hung heavy on her, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vala's face. Her sister's laughter echoed in her ears, but the joy that came with those memories was now tainted with the pain of loss. Yet, Kelra couldn't ignore the strange sense of relief that had begun to creep in. The camp wasn't home nothing, could ever replace what she had lost, but it was a place where she could breathe, where the burden of constant survival was shared. The people here were different. They had suffered just as she had, but they hadn't given up. She spent the next few days working with the others, getting used to the tasks they had assigned her. It wasn't much cleaning, organizing, preparing the camp for the uncertain future, but it was enough to keep her mind busy, to keep her from dwelling on the pain that seemed to consume her whenever she stopped moving. Despite everything, she found herself starting to trust the people around her. They didn't look at her with pity or fear. They saw her as just another survivor, someone who had endured, someone who had been through the fire and come out on the other side. It was one afternoon when Marcus approached her. his usual quiet presence drawing her attention. He had a way of making everything seem a little less heavy, a little more bearable. He had been working with the other soldiers, setting up defenses for the camp. But now he was standing beside her, looking down at her as she cleaned one of the shelters. "You've been quiet," he remarked, his voice soft but filled with concern. "Everything all right?" Kelra looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in days. There was something about the way he looked at her that made her want to open up, to tell him everything. But she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She wasn't sure if she'd ever be ready. "I'm justing," she said, her voice a little distant. "It's still hard to believe that everything is ... gone." Marcus nodded, as if he understood better than anyone else. He sat down beside her, resting his rifle across his knees. "It's not easy," he said quietly, "losing everything. But sometimes you have to find a reason to keep going." Kelra turned her head to look at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what if there's no reason left? What if you've lost everything you ever cared about? What's the point of fighting for something that's gone?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression soft but determined. "The point is that you're still here. And as long as you're still breathing, there's always a reason to fight." Kelra swallowed, the ache in her chest growing with his words. The idea of finding a new purpose seemed impossible, like trying to rebuild a shattered world from pieces that didn't fit together. But there was something in Marcus's voice that made her want to believe him. "What if I can't find that reason?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shrugged, the movement simple but filled with meaning. "Then you keep looking. You don't give up. You keep going, one day at a time. That's all anyone can do." Kelra didn't know what to say to that. The idea of pushing forward, of finding a reason to fight again, felt so foreign to her. But maybe Marcus was right. Maybe she didn't have to find all the answers right away. Maybe she just needed to take it one step at a time to keep moving forward. Even if she didn't know where that path would lead. The conversation fell into silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Kelra stared at the ground in front of her, the weight of her grief still pulling at her. But there was something else too. A flicker of hope, small but growing. For the first time since losing Vala, Kelra wondered if there was still something worth fighting for. Later that day, Elora approached Kelra while she was working on securing the perimeter of the camp. She looked just as tired as Kelra felt. Her movements slow but purposeful. "You've been out here for hours," Elora said, her voice soft but firm. "You need to rest." Kelra hesitated, looking at the task she had been working on. She didn't want to stop, didn't want to give into the exhaustion that threatened to consume her. The more she worked, the less she had to think, the less she had to feel. "I'm fine," Kelra replied, her voice quiet. "I need to keep busy." Elara didn't press, but her eyes softened. "I get it. I really do. But you can't run from the pain forever, Kelra. We've all been there. And we're all here to help you." Kelra glanced at Elara, her gaze flickering with the hint of something she didn't fully understand. "I don't know how to stop running," she said quietly. Alara smiled gently. "Then don't stop, but take a moment. Let someone else help carry the weight for a little while." Kelra looked down, her fingers tightening around the task at hand. Elara was right. She had been running for so long, trying to keep herself busy to avoid the unbearable weight of the loss. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let someone else in, to allow herself to stop and breathe, to lean on those around her for support. Kelra finally nodded, setting down the tools she had been holding. She wasn't sure what the future would bring or what her place was in this new world, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. Later that evening, Kelra sat with the others by the campfire. She felt something shift inside her. The pain was still there, gnawing at her heart, but there was something else, too. A glimmer of possibility. The weight of her grief had been replaced, if only for a moment, by the warmth of those around her. The camp, these people, they were offering her something she hadn't thought possible. Hope. The days in the camp seemed to blur into one another. Kelra had slowly become accustomed to the rhythm of life there, the daily tasks, the small conversations, and the unspoken understanding. That they were all survivors, each carrying their own burdens. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that kept her going when she wanted to give up. Every morning, Marcus would check in with her, his quiet presence now a comfort. She no longer felt like an outsider, though the shadow of her grief was still ever present. The days were long, but for the first time since Vala's death, Kelra felt like there was a faint light at the end of the tunnel. She still didn't know if she could ever truly heal from the pain. But at least here, among these people, there was a place for her to try. One afternoon, as Kelra worked alongside Alara, organizing supplies and reinforcing the camp's perimeter, the woman spoke up, breaking the silence between them. "You've been here for a while now," Alara said, her voice casual but thoughtful. "I think it's time you start helping us more. We're all in this together, and I think you could be an asset." Kelra looked up from the box of supplies she had been sorting through, meeting Alara's steady gaze. "Helping? How?" Her voice was hesitant. She wasn't sure if she had anything left to offer after everything she had lost. Alara smiled, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "You're a fighter. I can see it. You don't have to do anything major, just teach us what you know. We've all been through a lot, and we need someone like you to help us stay strong. Even if it's just with the basics of survival. Maybe, for once, you can stop running and start leading." Kelra felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. It wasn't just the offer, it was the recognition. For so long, she had been nothing but a survivor, fighting for her own life, her own future. She had never stopped to consider what it would be like to share that strength with others. "I don't know if I'm ready to lead," Kelra replied quietly, looking away. "I've lost too much to feel like I can teach anyone anything." Ilares' smile softened, and she placed a hand gently on Kelra's shoulder. "That's why you're perfect for it. You know what it means to lose everything. You know how to survive when it feels like you can't go on. That's the kind of strength we need here." Kelra was silent for a moment, the weight of Ilares' words sinking deep into her heart. She thought about her sister, about the years of training they had endured together. Vala had been the one who always led, who always took charge, while Kelra had followed. But now Vala was gone, and maybe it was time to take that step forward on her own. "I'll think about it," Kelra said, her voice quieter than she intended. Alara nodded, not pushing her, but Kelra could see the flicker of hope in her eyes. "You don't have to make a decision now. Just ... take it one step at a time, okay?" That night, after dinner, Kelra sat by the fire, her mind still spinning with Elara's words. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light over the camp as the others began to settle in for the night. Marcus was sitting across from her, cleaning his rifle, his focus sharp. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, glancing up at her with a faint smile. "Something on your mind?" Kelra took a deep breath, looking into the flames. "Ilara suggested I help with training the others. Did I teach them what I know?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think?" Kelra hesitated. The thought of teaching others, of leading them, was daunting. She had always relied on others to guide her, first Vala, then the other soldiers she had fought alongside. But leading was different. It meant responsibility. It meant being strong. When you didn't feel like it, could she really do that? "I'm not sure I'm the right person for it," Kelra said quietly. "I've lost so much. How could I possibly help anyone else? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. Because you've survived, Kelra. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. That's more than most can say. And sometimes, just sharing what you've learned. That's enough. Kelra glanced at him, meeting his eyes. She could see the sincerity there, the understanding. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of something other than grief, something like courage. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted, her voice soft. But maybe I can try. Marcus smiled, a warmth in his expression that eased some of her doubts. That's all any of us can do. Try. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to take the first step. The next morning, Kelra stood before a small group of survivors, her heart pounding in her chest. Ilara had gathered them around, and now they were looking at her, waiting. Okay, she said, clearing her throat. Her voice was rough, but she stood tall, her hands gripping the small wooden staff she had been given. This is how we survive. We take what we know, and we teach each other. She paused, trying to steady her breathing. I'm not going to tell you how to fight. I'm not going to tell you how to win wars. But I will show you how to stay alive when everything seems lost. The survivors nodded, some of them hesitant, others eager. Kelra could see their eyes on her, waiting. She had the floor. This was her moment, with a deep breath. She began. The days that followed Kelra's decision to help the survivors were filled with challenges, both external and internal. Leading a group of people who had seen more than their fair share of hardship was not easy. Every lesson she taught, every piece of advice she offered, felt like it might crumble under the weight of her own doubts. But with every day, she began to feel a little more certain. Her sessions with the survivors teaching them how to defend themselves, how to navigate through hostile terrain, how to stay alive when the world felt like it was ending, became a routine. It was grueling work, but it gave her purpose, a reason to move beyond her grief. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something. She was becoming a part of something, and in the quiet moments after the training was done, when she would sit by the fire with Marcus, she found herself slowly letting go of the pain. Not completely, but in tiny pieces. The weight was still there, the memory of Vala's face, the loss that had taken so much from her. But now there was a tiny flicker of light, a possibility, a chance that perhaps her future didn't have to be defined by her past. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and red, Kelra sat by the fire, her legs crossed, the familiar crackling warmth, a comfort. Marcus joined her, carrying a small bowl of stew. His easy smile made the weight of the day feel a little lighter. She had learned to trust him, to rely on him in ways she hadn't thought possible after everything that had happened. Everything going all right with the training? Marcus asked, handing her the bowl. Kelra nodded, accepting the food gratefully. They're learning, slowly but surely. Some of them are starting to open up. It feels like we're actually starting to make something of this place. Marcus sat down beside her, his eyes following the fire's glow. I think they're lucky to have you. You've come a long way, Kelra. You're not just surviving anymore. You're leading them. Kelra took a deep breath, considering his words. She hadn't thought about it that way. The weight of leadership had settled into her shoulders slowly, almost imperceptibly. She hadn't realized that, despite her grief, despite the pain, she had found a new purpose. It's a new role in this world. You really think I'm ready for this? She asked, glancing over at him. Marcus smiled gently. I think you were ready the moment you decided to try. Not everyone gets that kind of strength. Kelra didn't know how to respond to that. It was still hard for her to accept that she could be strong, that she could lead. But Marcus was right. She had taken the first step. And she wasn't alone anymore. She had found something to fight for again. As they ate in silence, Kelra's mind drifted back to the first day she had met Marcus. She had been lost in grief, unable to see beyond the pain. Now, though, as she sat beside him, watching the fire dance, she realized that she had come so much further than she ever thought possible. The group had begun to rebuild their lives, step by step. Each day was a struggle, but it was a struggle. They faced together, and in that struggle, Kelra had found her strength not in the weapons or the training, but in the bonds they had formed, in the trust they had placed in each other. The next morning, the camp was busy with preparations. A scouting party was being sent out to gather supplies from the nearby ruins, and Kelra had volunteered to join them. It wasn't just to prove herself, it was to protect the people who had become her new family, to fight for something she believed in. As they geared up for the journey, Marcus came to her side, his usual quiet confidence present in his posture. "You sure you're up for this?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he checked his rifle. Kelra smiled, a faint but real grin tugging at the corner of her lips. "I've been through worse." Marcus chuckled softly, giving her a look of approval. "All right then. Just stay safe, all right?" Kelra nodded, feeling the familiar surge of determination rise within her. She wasn't the same woman who had first arrived at the camp, broken by grief. She had found something to fight for, and she was willing to give everything to protect it. As the team set out into the dense forest, Kelra led the way, her eyes scanning their surroundings, alert to every rustle in the underbrush, every faint movement. The weight of the rifle at her side was no longer a burden. It felt like a part of her, a tool to ensure the survival of those who had become her family. The journey to the ruins wasn't easy. The path was treacherous, and the remnants of the war still loomed in every corner. Abandoned vehicles, destroyed buildings, and the ever-present risk of enemy forces. But Kelra pushed forward, her steps steady and sure, her mind focused on the mission. They couldn't afford to fail. When they reached the ruins, Kelra's heart sank. What had once been a thriving settlement was now nothing but charred remains. It was a graveyard of the past, a stark reminder of what had been lost. But as she looked around, she saw the same thing she had seen in the camp: determination. There was always something worth fighting for, even in the darkest places. After a successful raid, they gathered the supplies they needed and made their way back to the camp, each of them carrying the weight of the world, but also the hope of something better. Back at the camp, as Kelra set down the supplies, she looked around at the survivors who had come together. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She wasn't just someone trying to escape the past. She was part of this community. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to keep going. The future wasn't certain, but for the first time, Kelra felt like maybe, just maybe, she could carve out a place for herself in this broken world. Not just as a survivor, but as a leader. And as she stood there, watching the survivors begin to rebuild, she realized that in the midst of the pain and the loss, there was still something worth fighting for.